The wind blew fiercely that night, howling and sending the rain in torrents against the sides of the narrow, forgotten bookstore. Odd Ends had been tucked away in the shadow of an alley, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. I stumbled in out of the rain, my footsteps echoing in the cramped, low-ceilinged room as the smell of old paper and ink wrapped around me like a heavy fog. The shop was dimly lit, the lights flickering as though struggling against an unseen force. I scanned the rows of books, mostly disorganized piles on tables and shelves. They seemed like relics from other worlds, too old and too strange to belong here. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to pass the time. I'd always had a taste for the eerie and the unexplained, for tales of ghosts, demons, and otherworldly figures lurking in the shadows. Then I saw it. On a dusty, bottom shelf sat a book bound in cracked black leather, its edges worn and curling. There was no title, no author, just a peculiar symbol embossed into the cover. A slender figure with impossibly long limbs, stretching out into the darkness. The image stirred something within me, an unease that wrapped around my insides and tugged me closer. I couldn't resist reaching out to touch it. The book felt cold, colder than it should have been, and heavier, too, as though it carried more than mere pages. My fingers tingled as I picked it up, opening the cover carefully. The words inside were faded, handwritten in cramped, spidery lettering. Some pages had been torn, others stained with dark spots that looked uncomfortably like old blood. I turned to the first legible page and read, "For those who seek knowledge of the shadow that watches, beware. It has no name, but its presence is eternal. It walks unseen, hides in places forgotten, and lingers where light dares not tread. It is slender and silent, and those who call it forth may find themselves bound in darkness." My heart thumped against my chest as I read, but I couldn't put it down. I felt a strange pull, as if the book was demanding my attention. Page after page, there were fragmented descriptions of strange occurrences, spine-chilling accounts from people who had encountered a figure that fit the creature in the illustration. The words didn't describe what it looked like, exactly. Instead, they described how it felt. Every sighting, every encounter was steeped in overwhelming dread. They spoke of a faceless figure, tall and gaunt, with arms like spiders' legs, stretched too long to be human. I shivered, caught in a strange mixture of fear and fascination. Each page was more unsettling than the last, but I couldn't stop reading. I felt the weight of something enormous, something beyond understanding, pressing down on me. Eventually, I reached a page marked with a warning written in red ink, the letters smeared and faded. "The ritual is simple, but the price is great. To call forth the Slender One, draw the mark, recite the words, and invite it into your world. But take care, for once it has come, it cannot be sent back. It hungers, and it will not leave until it is satisfied." There was a hastily sketched drawing of a strange symbol, an eye surrounded by jagged lines, with two crossed lines beneath it. My fingers trembled as I traced the shape with my eyes, the cold dread settling in deeper. But against my better judgment, something inside me clicked. I had always been drawn to the strange and forbidden, chasing after the thrill of the unknown. Part of me laughed it off as superstition, but another part whispered to me, what if it's real? Before I realized what I was doing, I tucked the book under my arm and brought it to the front counter, where a graying, hollow-eyed man looked me up and down. He raised an eyebrow, his voice a low rumble as he muttered, "That one, eh? You know what you're doing." I hesitated, but curiosity won out over caution. "I'll take it," I said, forcing a smile. The man gave a slight shake of his head, as if pitying me. "It's your funeral," he muttered, ringing me up with hands that seemed to shake as he handed the book back to me. I stepped out into the rain again, clutching the book tightly. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely unnerved, as though an unseen presence had begun to shadow my every step. Back in my small apartment, I dried off, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and sat at my kitchen table with the book before me. The sound of the rain drumming against my windows faded into the background as I opened the pages again. I didn't care about the consequences or warnings. I only wanted to know if it was real. I kept reading, finding passages about strange shadows, about people who would see a slender figure lingering at the edge of their vision, vanishing the moment they turned to face it. Some of them had felt the urge to run, while others had been paralyzed with fear, trapped by an unearthly sense of dread. And then there were the rituals, the instructions on how to summon it. My eyes burned from reading, but I couldn't tear myself away. The words seemed to shift and twist on the page as though they were alive. I could feel an odd tingling sensation at the back of my neck, as if someone were standing just behind me, watching with an unblinking gaze. That night, the lines between curiosity and obsession began to blur. I stayed up for hours, devouring every detail, every instruction. By the time the sun began to rise, I'd read through the book 3 times. My mind buzzed with possibilities, with fragments of rituals, symbols, and cryptic warnings. Somewhere deep inside, I knew I'd crossed a line, that I should have put the book down and walked away, but I couldn't. Over the next few days, the book became my constant companion. I pored over its faded ink, sketching out diagrams, copying symbols, and memorizing the strange phrases in the language I didn't recognize. Sleep became a distant memory, my nights filled with feverish reading and restless dreams of shadows lurking just beyond the edge of my sight. I began to research, scouring the internet for anything about the figure in the book. To my surprise, there were countless accounts that matched the descriptions, eerie sightings of a faceless, slender figure with unnaturally long limbs, usually seen in forests, dark alleys, or on the outskirts of small towns. Some of these sightings went back decades. Others were as recent as a few months ago. The stories ranged from brief glimpses to harrowing encounters. People reported waking up in the middle of the night to see it standing in their bedroom doorway, its arms impossibly long, stretching forward as if reaching for them. They described the same bone-deep fear, the sensation of being watched, of their minds being pried open by something cold and unknowable. Some claimed they heard whispers in the dark, strange murmurs calling their names in the voice of someone they knew. I knew I should have been disturbed, even terrified, but instead, I felt a strange excitement building inside me, as though I were unraveling a secret no one else dared to touch. This wasn't just a figure of folklore or urban legend. It felt real, like I was on the edge of discovering something forbidden and vast, something that had been lurking in the shadows, unseen by all but a few. I barely ate, barely left my apartment. My friends started to notice my absence, messaging me, calling, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. Their voices on my voicemail sounded distant and unimportant, as if they existed in a different world. A few of them even showed up at my door, knocking, worried. I didn't answer. I couldn't let anyone interfere. Days bled together as I continued reading, taking notes, and piecing together the ritual. Each night, I would feel that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as though I were being watched. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners of my vision, twisting and shifting whenever I turned my head. At first, I thought it was exhaustion, my tired mind playing tricks. But as the days went on, I wasn't so sure. One night, as I was poring over the final pages of the book, I heard a faint whisper. My name, soft and drawn out, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. It sent a shiver down my spine, but it also sent a thrill of excitement racing through me. I looked around, but the apartment was empty. The only sound was the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of floorboards settling. I closed the book, pressing my palms against the worn cover, feeling the weight of the ancient knowledge within it. This wasn't just some collection of horror stories. It was a guide, an invitation to something beyond comprehension. I pulled out a notebook and began mapping out the ritual, using the fragmented instructions I'd found scattered throughout the pages. The ritual had 3 parts: a summoning chant, a symbol to be drawn, and a sacrifice. Though the details of what exactly needed to be sacrificed were vague, I assumed it was something personal, something that mattered deeply to me. The book warned that once the ritual was complete, the entity would be summoned, bound to me. But it gave no hint about what would happen after that. I didn't care. By this point, I was in too deep. I'd dedicated too many hours, given up too much to turn back now. I was going to see this through to the end. The next day, I started gathering what I needed. I bought candles, charcoal to draw the symbol, and a vial of animal blood from a butcher on the other side of town. My heart pounded in my chest as I carried each item back to my apartment, feeling like I was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. That night, I spread the items out on the floor, carefully following the instructions as I sketched the symbol from the book. The eye surrounded by jagged lines, with the crossed lines beneath it. As I finished, I felt an unnatural chill seep into the room, prickling my skin. I checked the windows. They were all shut. The chill wasn't coming from outside. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I knew what came next. I grabbed a piece of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, the last thing she'd given me before she passed away. It was precious to me, the one thing I held onto as a reminder of her. I placed it in the center of the symbol, where the book had said to put the sacrifice. I hesitated, a pang of guilt slicing through me, but quickly shoved it aside. This was necessary. I whispered the words from the book, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables but pushing forward, my voice shaky. As I chanted, the shadows around the room seemed to deepen, stretching and writhing. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. The light from the candles flickered wildly, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights steadied again, the temperature in the room dropped even further. My breath fogged in the cold, and the room felt charged, as if something vast and unseen had entered the space. The shadows pooled around the edges of the room, thick and suffocating. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to end this and forget I'd ever started. But it was too late. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just at the edge of the candlelight, a figure began to take shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It was thin, a spindly silhouette with limbs that stretched too long, too far. And it was faceless, its head smooth and blank, like a mannequin. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and piercing, even though it had no eyes. My body locked in place, frozen by an intense, primal fear that gripped my heart and squeezed. I wanted to scream, to look away, but my gaze was trapped, drawn to the creature. It was like being caught in a nightmare, where no amount of force could make my body move. The figure didn't advance, didn't reach out, but it was closer now, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from its form, seeping into my bones. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, each one clouding the air in front of me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. One blink and the figure was gone, leaving only the smothering cold and the overwhelming sense that it was still here, lurking just out of sight, waiting. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, needing some kind of light, some connection to reality. But my screen was blank, dead, unresponsive no matter how many times I pressed the power button. My mind raced, frantically trying to rationalize what had just happened. Had I hallucinated it? Was it a trick of the candlelight? Deep down, though, I knew the truth. I had summoned something, brought it into my world, and now it was watching me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, the cold, unblinking presence of something lurking in the shadows. I could almost feel its gaze pressing down on me, like a weight I couldn't shake. I sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching my knees, my back pressed against the wall, staring out into the darkness of my apartment. Every shadow seemed to pulse with hidden life, stretching just a little too far, holding a depth that hadn't been there before. I kept seeing it in the corners of my vision, a fleeting glimpse of an impossibly tall, faceless figure. But every time I whipped my head around, there was nothing, only the dark, silent room. The first light of dawn crept through my window, pale and thin, barely enough to chase the darkness away. But in the morning light, things felt almost normal again. Almost. The chill in the air had faded, and the shadows seemed less menacing. For a brief, precious moment, I let myself believe that it was over, that the figure was gone. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. I'd called it, summoned it with the ritual, and it wasn't going to leave until it had taken what it wanted. I tried to go back to my regular life, convincing myself that it had all been a bad dream, that I'd imagined the figure in the dark. But the signs wouldn't let me forget. Everywhere I went, I felt that strange chill, the sensation of eyes boring into the back of my skull, the shadows creeping just a little too close. On the third day, as I walked down the narrow corridor to my apartment, I saw it again. It was a glimpse, just for a second. A tall, dark figure standing at the end of the hallway, arms hanging low at its sides, its head bent slightly as though watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was only a shadow, a trick of the light, I tried to tell myself. But as I stood there, rooted in fear, it seemed to grow clearer, more defined, the air around it thick with that unnatural chill. I blinked, and it was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had only moved closer. The encounters grew more frequent after that. At first, it was only in fleeting glimpses, shadows in my periphery, shapes that vanished the moment I turned my head. But soon, it started showing up in mirrors, reflections in windows. I would catch sight of it in the glass, standing just behind me, its faceless head turned toward me, that blank, oppressive stare piercing through the reflection. And every time I looked back, it would be gone. My apartment grew darker, colder, as if the light itself had begun to fade. No amount of lamps or open windows seemed to banish the shadows that crept into every corner, pooling in thick, suffocating patches around the rooms. My plants wilted, their leaves curling and browning, as though the air itself had turned toxic. Even the air felt thick, heavy with a strange, almost metallic scent that clung to my skin. Friends continued to call, their voices increasingly desperate, but I stopped answering. I was afraid that if I let them in, if I let anyone get close, the Slender Man would notice and take them too. The night after my third sighting in the hallway, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, barely audible at first, like nails scraping against wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, a steady, rhythmic scraping coming from just outside my bedroom door. I could feel my pulse hammering against my ribs as I reached for my phone, trying to call for help, but the screen was blank again, just like that first night. It was dead, even though I'd charged it before I'd gone to bed. I stood up, every instinct in my body screaming at me to hide, to run, but I couldn't move. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as though something were clawing its way through the wood, desperate to get in. Then, as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. I let out a shaky breath, the air cold as it left my lips. My hand was trembling as I reached for the door handle, heart racing as I debated opening it. But something in me knew I had to look, had to see if it was still there. I opened the door a crack, peeking into the darkness of my living room. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, as though alive, and I could feel the chill in the air, the unmistakable presence of something watching me. But there was nothing there. No figure, no movement. Only the dark, empty room. I closed the door, my hands shaking. The scratching didn't come back that night, but the feeling of dread stayed with me, curling around my insides like a poison. As the days passed, my world began to crumble around me. I barely ate, barely slept, afraid that every moment of rest would bring another encounter. I started to lose track of time, entire days slipping by in a haze of fear and paranoia. I was haunted by the faintest noises, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the faint whisper of my name echoing from somewhere unseen. But the worst part wasn't the sightings or the noises. It was the dreams. Every night, I would close my eyes and find myself back in that dark, suffocating room from the ritual. The shadows would press in around me, heavy and thick, and I would feel it watching, always watching, just beyond the edge of the light. Sometimes it would reach out, its long, spindly arms stretching toward me, its blank, faceless head bending low as though studying me. Other times, it would just stand there, silent and still, its presence as crushing as a physical weight. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the taste of fear bitter in my mouth, and every time I would find myself half expecting to see it standing at the foot of my bed. One night, after another sleepless stretch, I decided I had to put an end to this. I couldn't keep living like this, haunted and hunted in my own home. I knew I'd made a mistake summoning it, that I'd broken some boundary I couldn't repair. But maybe, if I tried hard enough, I could find a way to reverse the ritual, to banish the Slender Man back to wherever it had come from. I returned to the book, flipping through its pages with desperation. There were notes, references to entities being bound to objects, to blood sacrifices and symbols of power. But nothing concrete. Nothing that would tell me how to send it away. My heart pounded as I read and reread the pages, searching for any clue, any hint of a way out. The text seemed to taunt me, shifting and twisting, almost as if the words themselves were laughing at my helplessness. I could feel its presence growing stronger, the air around me growing colder as I searched, that same metallic scent filling the room. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a passage scrawled in the margin, almost hidden in the folds of the page. The handwriting was shaky, frantic, and barely legible. It feeds on fear. The more you give it, the stronger it becomes. Do not let it see your terror. Do not give it the satisfaction. Only then might it leave you in peace. My hands trembled as I read those words, and a chill ran down my spine. I had been feeding it all along, feeding it with every gasp of fear, every sleepless night, every terrified glance over my shoulder. I had let it into my world, and it had grown stronger with each heartbeat, each shiver of dread. I sat there, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. If I wanted to rid myself of it, I would have to stop fearing it. I would have to face it, stand before it without letting my terror show. But the thought was almost laughable. How could I look into the empty, faceless void of that thing and not feel fear? But I had no other choice. This was my only chance. I took a deep breath, closing the book and steeling myself. I would face it. I would summon it one last time, and this time I would refuse to be afraid. I didn't know if I would survive, but I knew I had to try. That night, as darkness swallowed my apartment, I made up my mind. If this was my only way out, I had to take it. Fear had consumed me, but this time I would not let it win. I spent hours gathering my resolve, repeating to myself that I would stand strong, that I would look into the faceless void and feel nothing. I turned off every light, letting the darkness settle around me. I took the book with me to the living room, lit a single candle, and placed it in the center of the symbol on the floor. The faint orange glow cast shifting shadows, stretching the lines of the summoning symbol across the walls. My heart hammered, but I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe slowly. With every ounce of willpower, I whispered the words again. This time, they rolled off my tongue with a strange familiarity, as if they'd always been in my mind, just waiting to be called. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to thicken, wrapping around me like a suffocating cloak. I felt the temperature drop to an icy chill, each breath fogging in the candlelight. And then it came. The Slender Man appeared, emerging from the darkness at the edge of my vision, taller and more menacing than ever before. It seemed to drink in the shadows, its figure blending into the dark, so thin and stretched it barely seemed human. Its head tilted, focusing on me without eyes, yet I could feel its attention, its malice, settling on me like a heavy weight. I swallowed, forcing down the terror bubbling inside me. This time, I didn't let my eyes dart away. I held its gaze, staring into the empty void of its face. I could feel my instincts screaming to look away, to run, but I held my ground, whispering to myself, it's just a trick. It feeds on fear. The Slender Man didn't move. It just stood there, waiting, as though daring me to break. Every nerve in my body begged me to flee, to do anything to escape that cold, silent figure. But I stayed rooted to the spot, clenching my fists so tightly my nails bit into my palms. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, it began to move, shifting closer in a way that seemed wrong, as if it weren't bound by the laws of space. 1 second it was across the room, and the next it was closer, looming over me, a darkness so intense it blotted out everything else. My pulse hammered, and a sick wave of fear rose up, choking me, but I fought it down, focusing on my breathing, clinging to the thought that if I didn't react, if I showed no fear, maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. It leaned closer, bending low, its head tilting to mere inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating off it, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing against me, testing my resolve. My mind screamed, my muscles tensed, but I refused to let it show. I met the blank, empty face and whispered, "I'm not afraid of you." Its head cocked to the side, an unsettling, unnatural motion, as though it were studying me. For a brief moment, the edges of its form seemed to blur, to flicker, and a faint whisper drifted into my mind. A voice that wasn't mine, but that felt like a memory long forgotten. "Are you certain?" The voice was soft, gentle even, but it carried an undertone of malice, a threat hidden beneath the calm. I swallowed, my throat dry. "Yes?" I whispered, forcing the words past my clenched teeth. "You have no power over me." The Slender Man straightened, its head turning slightly as if listening. Then, slowly, it took a step back, fading into the shadows until only the faint outline remained. The cold receded, the shadows easing their grip, and I felt the crushing weight of its presence begin to lift. Relief flooded through me, and I almost let myself believe it was over, that I'd done it. But that's when I heard it. A soft scratching, barely audible, like nails against wood. The sound was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and froze. In the reflection of the darkened window, I saw it, standing just inches behind me, closer than ever, its faceless head almost touching mine. The shadow of its arm lifted, stretching impossibly long, its spindly fingers reaching toward me. I could feel the icy air around me, pressing in, tightening, as though the Slender Man had wrapped me in its grip. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, every muscle frozen in place, unable to move as the figure loomed over me, its presence filling every inch of space, every breath. Then, in a voice that echoed inside my mind, it whispered, "You are mine now." The next few days passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I tried everything I could think of to banish it, reciting phrases I'd found online, burning sage, even scratching the summoning symbol off my floor. But nothing worked. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. I would see its reflection in every window, its shape flickering in the corner of my eye. It was haunting me, stalking me, a relentless, unyielding presence that had seeped into every corner of my life. The dreams grew worse, too. Every night, I would find myself back in that same dark space, with the Slender Man standing just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, cold and suffocating, and every time I thought I might wake up, I'd hear it whispering, softly, "You are mine." My sanity was slipping. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I barely left my apartment, and when I did, I felt its presence following me, lingering at the edges of my vision. I tried calling friends, desperate for some sense of reality, but their voices felt distant, hollow, like echoes from another world. Every time I tried to explain what was happening, my voice would falter, the words fading as though some invisible force were strangling the life out of them. No one understood. How could they? I barely understood myself. One night, as I lay awake in bed, staring into the darkness, I felt something cold against my hand. I looked down and saw a shadowy, spindly finger stretching across the sheets, curling around my wrist with a grip like iron. My blood turned to ice as I followed the length of the arm up to where the Slender Man stood, towering over me, its head tilted to the side in that unnerving, curious way. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it leaned closer, its faceless void of a head inches from mine. I felt its cold breath against my skin, and I knew, in that moment, that I was truly trapped, that there was no escaping it. I had summoned it, brought it into my world, and now it was claiming me, piece by piece, feeding off my fear, my despair, until there was nothing left. It lingered there for a moment, its grip tightening, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest, the terror clawing its way up my throat. But even as my body shook with fear, a part of me felt something else, something darker. I felt its hunger, its need. It was feeding on my fear, draining me, consuming every shred of terror I offered it. And in that moment, a sick, twisted realization settled over me. If I couldn't banish it, if I couldn't escape it, then maybe I could starve it. The next day, I forced myself out of bed, standing in front of the mirror, staring into my own hollow, bloodshot eyes. I felt weak, broken, a shell of the person I'd been before this nightmare began. But as I looked into my reflection, I felt a spark of defiance rise within me, a fierce, desperate determination to reclaim my life. I would fight it. I wouldn't let it consume me. For the next few days, I kept myself busy. I cleaned my apartment, rearranged my furniture, filled my space with as much light as I could manage. Every time I felt the Slender Man's presence, every time I saw its shape lurking in the shadows, I forced myself to ignore it, to look past it as though it weren't there. It was always there, of course, in the mirror, in the windows, standing just beyond the reach of the light. But I refused to acknowledge it. I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. The more I ignored it, the more restless it seemed to become, its appearances growing more frequent, more desperate. I could feel its anger, its frustration, pressing down on me like a storm. But I held strong, refusing to let it see my fear. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, bit by bit, its presence began to fade. The shadows grew lighter, the cold less intense. I could feel my strength returning, my mind clearing, as though a fog had lifted. But every night, as I lay in bed, I could still feel it watching, waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. It was weaker now, barely a whisper, a shadow of the nightmare it had once been. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was just waiting, biding its time. And so I live, day by day, haunted by the lingering shadow of the Slender Man. I know it's still there, waiting for the moment my guard slips, waiting for the crack in my resolve. And when that day comes, I fear it will claim me for good. Despite my efforts to ignore it, the Slender Man's presence remained, a faint shadow that followed me everywhere. I tried to pretend it wasn't there, tried to live my life as if nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. It was still watching, always watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. The weeks passed, and I managed to cling to some semblance of normalcy. I returned to work, answered calls from friends, and ventured outside my apartment more often, hoping that if I surrounded myself with people and activity, the shadow would finally loosen its hold. But even in the crowded city streets, I felt it. A flicker in a shop window, a dark shape in a passing car's reflection, a shiver of cold that lingered in my wake. One evening, I was walking home, the streets empty as the sky darkened. I told myself I was safe, that the Slender Man wouldn't follow me here, out in the open. But as I turned a corner, I felt it, a chill that crept up my spine, sinking into my bones. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, every instinct screaming for me to run. I resisted. I couldn't let it see my fear. I walked faster, forcing myself to keep calm, focusing on the sounds of my footsteps, the weight of my breath. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A tall, thin figure, standing at the end of the street, half shrouded in shadow, arms hanging limp and heavy at its sides. It was watching me. Even without eyes, I could feel its gaze like a spotlight, piercing through the darkness. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to walk past it, my head held high. I didn't acknowledge it, didn't let myself look. I told myself it wasn't real, that I was safe, that I'd broken its hold. But as I passed, I heard it, a low, rasping whisper, echoing through my mind, a sound that seemed to shake the very core of my being. I am always with you. The words sank into me like ice, spreading through my veins. I stumbled, nearly falling, but caught myself, refusing to look back. I made it home, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the floor, heart racing, breath coming in ragged gasps. I thought I could starve it, weaken it, but it was growing stronger again, feeding off the fear I couldn't seem to shake. My resolve was breaking, cracking under the pressure of its relentless presence. I couldn't keep living like this. I needed help. I needed a way out. Desperation drove me to places I never thought I'd go. I reached out to paranormal forums, sending messages to people I'd once laughed at, those who claimed they could commune with spirits and banish demons. Most of them ignored me or dismissed me as another gullible fool. But one person replied. They called themselves Watcher, and their message was brief. The words simple but chilling. It's too late. Once invited, it cannot be sent back. It will consume you slowly, until there's nothing left but a hollow shell. The words sent a shiver down my spine, a pang of despair clawing at my insides. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, to curse this Watcher for their hopeless response. But something in their message kept me reading, a tiny flicker of morbid curiosity driving me on. I typed out a reply, asking if there was anything I could do, any way to sever the connection. For hours, there was no answer, and I was beginning to lose hope when my phone buzzed with a single message. It can be weakened, but only by severing all ties to the world. Starve it of everything, no friends, no family, no hope. When it is weak enough, there may be a chance to break free. But this path is dangerous, and once you begin, there is no turning back. I stared at the message, the implications sinking in. I would have to give up everything, isolate myself from everyone I loved, cut myself off completely from the life I'd once known. It was a horrifying thought, but in that moment, I felt a flicker of grim determination. I didn't have a choice. Either I would give it everything it wanted, let it consume my life piece by piece, or I would take control, fight back with everything I had. And if that meant walking into the darkness alone, so be it. I spent the next week saying quiet goodbyes. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I couldn't. I lied, telling my friends I was going away for a while, that I needed space to sort some things out. Their concern, their sadness, their confusion. It all felt like a distant echo, like I was watching someone else's life unravel. I deleted my social media, erased my contacts, sold anything I didn't need. I cut every tie, every connection, letting go of everything that anchored me to this world. I felt like I was drifting into an empty void, a hollow shell of who I'd once been. But even as the loneliness consumed me, I felt a strange sense of calm, a numbness that dulled the fear. The Slender Man grew weaker, its appearances less frequent, its presence a faint shadow rather than a suffocating weight. I could feel it fading, its hold loosening, as though it were struggling to cling to the fragments of my fear. I thought I was winning, that I'd finally found a way to starve it out. But then, something changed. One night, as I lay in my empty apartment, I felt a presence unlike anything I'd ever known. It wasn't the Slender Man. It was something darker, more insidious, a malevolence that seemed to ooze from the shadows, filling every corner with a suffocating dread. I sat up, my heart pounding, feeling the weight of something massive pressing down on me. The air grew cold, thick with the stench of decay, and I heard a faint whisper, low and mocking, echoing through the silence. You cannot escape. The Slender Man had been watching, yes, but it had only been the beginning, a fragment of something far more terrible. I realized then that by severing my connections, by isolating myself, I had opened a door to something deeper, something that was waiting for the moment my life was drained of hope, of light. It had been waiting, lurking in the background, and now, with nothing left to hold me back, it was coming for me. Desperation gripped me, a frantic need to find some way out. I couldn't let this thing consume me, couldn't let it take everything I had fought so hard to keep. In a last, desperate attempt, I reopened the book, searching for anything I'd missed, any clue to sever the connection once and for all. I found it, scrawled in the final pages, barely legible in faded ink. The only way to break the bond is to give it what it desires. A soul willingly surrendered. But beware, for the price is steep, and once given, it cannot be undone. The words filled me with a cold, sinking dread. A soul willingly surrendered. I understood now. It wasn't my fear the Slender Man was after. It was my surrender, my submission. It wanted me to give up, to let it take everything I was. And I knew, deep down, that if I gave in, if I surrendered, it would consume me entirely, leaving nothing but an empty shell. But perhaps there was another way. I took the book, my heart heavy, my mind racing, and made my way to the place where this nightmare had begun. The secluded woods just outside town. It was a place of silence, of deep shadows and twisting paths, a place where light seemed to die. Under the cover of darkness, I opened the book, flipping to the page with the summoning symbol. I drew it again, careful, precise, feeling the weight of every line, every curve. This time, I added one final touch, my own blood, drawn from a cut across my palm, smearing it over the symbol. And then, with a steady breath, I spoke the words one last time, calling the Slender Man into the circle, binding it to me with the same force I'd used before. I felt the shadows shift, the air thickening, as the Slender Man appeared, its form stretching impossibly tall, its faceless head bending toward me. But this time I didn't look away. I met its gaze, my voice calm as I whispered, "Take me if you must, but I will not surrender." It stood there, unmoving, as though testing my resolve. And in that moment, I felt a shift, a loosening of the cold grip around my heart, as though some invisible chain had broken. The Slender Man tilted its head, almost curious, as though it hadn't expected this defiance, this final act of resistance. Then, slowly, it began to fade, the darkness retreating, its form dissolving into shadow. I felt the weight lift, the cold recede, and I knew it was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was alone. But as I left the woods, the silence following me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had shifted within me. I had stared into the void, and it had stared back. And though I had survived, a part of me wondered if I would ever truly escape its shadow. I wish I could say that was the end, that facing down the Slender Man broke its hold over me completely, that I returned to my old life and never looked back. But even though I'd weakened it, sent it retreating back into whatever dark corner of reality it came from, I knew deep down that it wasn't truly gone. I could feel the weight of it in the silence, lingering like a shadow just beyond the edges of my awareness. Days turned into weeks, and though the encounter stopped, the sense of being watched never fully left me. My apartment was empty, my life hollow, and my friends were little more than distant memories. In my isolation, I found myself consumed by a cold, creeping dread, a feeling that something was waiting, watching for the moment I let my guard down. But it wasn't until a cold, stormy night months later that I realized I hadn't won. Started like any other night. I was lying in bed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, my mind weighed down by the quiet emptiness that had become my life. The storm raged outside, the rain tapping against my window in an endless rhythm, lulling me into a false sense of peace. Then, a noise shattered the silence. A faint, scraping sound, like nails dragging across glass. My heart leapt in my chest, the memory of that sound freezing me in place. I forced myself to look toward the window, expecting to see the rain-streaked glass, the faint glow of distant streetlights. But instead, I saw it. A dark, spindly hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed, leaving long, thin streaks of frost in its wake. My blood ran cold as my gaze traveled up, to where the faceless, towering figure stood outside my window, its head tilted in that unnerving, familiar way, watching me. The Slender Man had returned. My hands shook as I slowly rose from the bed, my pulse thundering in my ears. I thought I'd banished it, driven it away. But here it was, more real, more solid than ever before, its form casting a shadow across the room, filling it with an oppressive, suffocating cold. Its hands slid down the glass, the scratching sound intensifying, grating against my nerves. I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing into my mind, probing for any hint of fear, any crack in my resolve. I forced myself to breathe, to remember the strength I'd found in those woods. I had faced it once, I could do it again. Taking a shaky breath, I spoke, my voice barely a whisper. "You don't control me." The Slender Man didn't move, but the room grew colder, the shadows thickening around it, almost pulsing with a malevolent energy. Then, slowly, it reached up, placing one finger against the glass. It began to trace a shape, its movements slow and deliberate, leaving a frosty mark that took shape before my eyes. A symbol I recognized all too well. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. It was the same symbol from the book, the symbol I'd used to summon it. And in that moment I understood it was bound to me not by its will but by mine. I had called it, brought it into my world, and now it was tied to me, bound to haunt me for as long as I was willing to let it. The Slender Man pressed its hand against the glass again, leaning closer, its head tilting as though to meet my gaze. I could feel its presence pressing against my mind, an unspoken challenge hanging heavy in the air. A thought flashed through my mind, dark and desperate. End it. This ends tonight. I didn't know what it would take, but I knew I had to sever this bond. And the only way to do that was to confront it fully, to face it in a way I hadn't before. I had to take it back to the place where I'd summoned it, the place where the bond had been forged. The storm followed me as I made my way to the woods, the rain pounding against my skin, the cold biting into my bones. I could feel the Slender Man behind me, a dark shadow that seemed to stretch across the night, its presence more tangible than ever before. Every step I took felt like a step deeper into some dark, forbidden realm, a place where the boundary between our world and the unknown was thin, fragile. I reached the clearing where I'd performed the ritual, the ground slick with mud and rain. The trees loomed around me, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, shrouded in shadows. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and stepped into the center of the clearing. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed a sharp stone from the ground, holding it tightly, the edge biting into my palm. I crouched down and drew the symbol again, the eye and the crossed lines beneath it, carving it into the wet earth with shaking hands. I could feel the Slender Man watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight, as though it knew what I was doing. When I finished, I stood, facing the dark figure looming at the edge of the clearing. I could barely see it now, barely distinguish its form from the shadows, but I could feel it. A force, a presence that seemed to seep into the very air, poisoning it with an unnatural dread. The shadows thickened around it, twisting and writhing, as though they were alive. I forced myself to speak, my voice hoarse, but steady. "This ends now. I am not afraid of you." The Slender Man tilted its head, its form blurring, distorting, as though it were unraveling. But the darkness only grew, the shadows twisting tighter, pulsing with a power I could barely comprehend. I could feel it reaching into my mind, trying to stir my fear, trying to pull me back into its grip. But I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. I stood my ground, staring into the darkness, refusing to look away. "I release you," I said, my voice echoing through the clearing. "I release you from my mind, my life, my world. You have no power over me." For a moment, everything was silent. The wind died, the rain stopped, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the Slender Man began to fade, its form unraveling, dissolving into the shadows. But just before it disappeared completely, I felt it reach into my mind one last time, a cold whisper that echoed through the silence. "This is not the end. I will wait. I will watch. And when you forget, when you falter, I will return." And then it was gone. I stood alone in the clearing, the rain beginning to fall again, the cold seeping into my bones. I felt a strange emptiness, a numbness that spread through my entire being. I had broken the bond, driven it back into the darkness, but I knew it would never truly leave me. It would always be there, lurking at the edges of my mind, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. But as I made my way back through the woods, a faint sense of peace settled over me. I had faced it, looked into the void, and refused to surrender. I had survived. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The shadows no longer held the same menacing weight. The chill in the air had faded, and the constant sense of being watched was gone. I reconnected with my friends, picked up the pieces of my life, and began to rebuild. But even now, I still feel it sometimes. A flicker in the corner of my vision, a whisper in the dark, a faint, lingering chill that reminds me of the Slender Man's final words. I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. And every night, as I lie in bed, I remind myself that I am not afraid. But deep down, in the quietest parts of my mind, I wonder, how long can I hold on?